The guests began to gather early, filling the spacious garden venue with a hum of conversation and bursts of laughter. The sun hovered gently above, casting a warm glow over the manicured lawns and intricately designed flower arrangements. White roses and lavender were intertwined across the entrance archway, their fragrance mixing with the fresh scent of the morning dew. The air buzzed with an anticipation that seemed to draw everyone closer together, unified by the celebration about to unfold. Inside a grand tent adorned with flowing satin drapes, the finishing touches were being applied. Tables were set with shimmering silverware and crystal glasses that sparkled in the sunlight streaming through the clear panels of the tent. Each centerpiece, a cascade of hydrangeas, lilies, and baby's breath, seemed to exude elegance and perfection, setting the tone for the day ahead. Alex stood at the far end of the garden with his best man, adjusting his tie nervously. His tailored navy blue suit, accented with a boutonniere matching the floral arrangements, fitted him impeccably, but he couldn't stop fidgeting. Guests stopped by to pat him on the back, offering congratulatory remarks and playful jabs to ease his nerves. Yet, Alex's eyes kept darting toward the house, where Lila was still out of sight. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Lila, meanwhile, was upstairs in the bridal suite. The room was a flurry of activity as bridesmaids flitted around, fixing veils, arranging flowers, and helping her step into her gown. Her dress was breathtaking, a blend of classic and modern, with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing chiffon train that seemed to float with her every step. Lila's mother stood nearby, dabbing tears from her eyes, while the makeup artist gave a final touch to the soft shimmer on her cheeks. Lila took a deep breath, her heart pounding, not with fear but with the weight of the moment and the love she felt for Alex. Outside, the orchestra began to warm up, their gentle melodies adding a layer of sophistication to the joyful chatter of the guests. The children, dressed in miniature versions of formal attire, ran around giggling, their high-pitched laughter punctuating the refined atmosphere with bursts of innocence. Elderly relatives, seated at the best vantage points, swapped stories of their own weddings and remarked on how radiant the couple looked together. As the time of the ceremony approached, an usher began guiding guests toward their seats, lining them along the path leading to a beautifully decorated altar. A magnificent arch of pastel-colored blooms framed the spot where Alex and Lila would exchange their vows. The setup was nothing short of magical, a dream brought to life with every meticulous detail, from the polished mahogany chairs to the string lights waiting to illuminate the evening. In the midst of this orchestrated perfection, small hiccups arose, just enough to remind everyone of the humanity beneath the extravagance. A ring-bearer got stage fright and refused to let go of his father's leg, and a bridesmaid nearly tripped on the hem of her gown. These little mishaps, however, only added to the charm of the day, bringing laughter and camaraderie among the guests. Alex's heart skipped a beat when the soft chime of the bells announced Lila's imminent arrival. He straightened his posture, his hands clasping and unclasping as he tried to contain his emotions. The murmurs among the guests hushed to a silence, anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Then the doors of the house opened, and Lila appeared. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The sunlight caught her veil, creating a halo effect as she descended the steps with grace. Her father held her arm, his pride and love etched deeply into his face. Alex's breath caught, his eyes never leaving hers as she made her way toward him. It was as though the distance between them disappeared with each step, until finally, they stood together at the altar. The officiant began, his voice steady and warm, but for Alex and Lila, the words seemed to blur into the background. Their gazes locked, and the entire world faded away, leaving only the two of them and the promises they were about to make. Yet, beneath the surface of this idyllic scene, the slightest tension flickered, a fragile undercurrent of vulnerability, the weight of a future unknown but deeply desired. Guests watched with rapt attention, some dabbing at their eyes with tissues while others smiled widely, their hearts swelling with the emotion of the moment. The air was thick with an almost sacred energy as Alex and Lila prepared to say the words that would bind their lives together. The perfection of the day was undeniable. Yet, like all weddings, it wasn't just the decor or the guests or the music that made it unforgettable. It was the raw, unfiltered humanity, the laughter, the tears, the nerves, that made it resonate so deeply with everyone present. And as Alex and Lila exchanged their vows, their voices trembling slightly but filled with certainty, the moment was sealed with a kiss that brought cheers and applause from the crowd. The wedding had officially begun, marking the start of a new chapter in their lives. A chapter filled with hope, love, and the promise of countless tomorrows. As the vows faded into the echoes of applause, Alex's heart swelled with pride and love. His hand remained entwined with Lila's as they turned to face the sea of cheering faces. It felt surreal, as if he were walking through a dream, the kind where everything gleamed brighter, where joy was unfiltered and absolute. The celebration continued seamlessly into the reception, the transition marked by glasses clinking and the soft hum of the orchestra shifting into lively melodies. The open garden where the reception was held glimmered under the golden hour. Guests mingled around the tables, laughter floating in the air like confetti. Alex found himself pulled into conversations at every corner. A quick handshake here, a heartfelt congratulations there. Every guest wanted a moment with the groom, and he obliged graciously, though his eyes constantly sought Lila through the crowd. Finally, his gaze landed on her. She was laughing softly with one of her bridesmaids, the sunlight catching in her hair. It was a vision Alex wished he could frame in his memory forever. But as he stepped forward to join her, she glanced over her shoulder and slipped away toward the edge of the garden. Her movements were quick, deliberate, as though she didn't want to be noticed. Alex hesitated, unsure of what he had just seen. At first, he thought it was simply a matter of her needing a moment of respite. After all, the day had been overwhelming for both of them. But then he saw another figure break away from the crowd. Jackson. His best friend and the man he had chosen as one of his groomsmen. Alex's stomach twisted as he watched Jackson glance around furtively before following in the same direction Lila had taken. An uneasy knot tightened in Alex's chest. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that he was being paranoid. Jackson and Lila had always gotten along well. There was no reason to suspect anything unusual. Yet, something in the way they moved, the secretive glances, the hurried pace, gnawed at him. Unable to resist the pull of suspicion, Alex began walking toward the edge of the garden, his steps slow and careful. The guests were too engrossed in their celebrations to notice him. Alex maneuvered through the throng of laughter and conversation until he reached a dense line of hedges that marked the boundary of the garden. Beyond it was a small, secluded gazebo, partially hidden by the drooping branches of a willow tree. It was a picturesque spot, one they had admired together during the venue selection. It was also where he saw them now, Lila and Jackson, standing close, their voices hushed. At first, Alex couldn't hear what they were saying. He ducked behind the hedges, feeling a wave of shame at his own actions. Spying on his wife on their wedding day, no less, it felt beneath him. But the sight of Jackson leaning in toward Lila, his hand brushing against her arm, made Alex freeze. He strained to catch their words. "You can't keep doing this, Jackson," Lila said, her voice low but firm. There was a tremble in it, a vulnerability that Alex didn't recognize. "Not today. It's wrong. It's wrong because you won't admit the truth," Jackson shot back, his voice edged with desperation. "You don't love him the way you think you do. I see it every time you look at me." Alex's blood ran cold. He gripped the hedge for support, his mind racing to process what he was hearing. Surely this was some kind of misunderstanding. A joke even. But the tension in their voices left no room for doubt. "Stop it," Lila hissed. "This is my wedding day. Alex is my husband now. Whatever we had, it's over." Jackson laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and mocking. "Pet? You think you can just erase it? Pretend it never happened? I've been here for you, Lila, through everything. I've seen the real you, the you that Alex could never understand." Alex felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. He wanted to burst out from his hiding spot, demand answers, make sense of this betrayal. But his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted in place, his body paralyzed by a mix of fury and humiliation. Lila's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "I made my choice, Jackson. I chose Alex. I love him. And you need to respect that." Jackson took a step closer to her, his voice dropping to a whisper. If you loved him, you wouldn't have come to me last month. You wouldn't have kissed me the way you did. The words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. He felt the breath leave his body, a sharp pain lodging itself in his chest. His wife, his Lila, had kissed another man. And not just any man, but Jackson, his best friend. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. Lila's face crumpled, her resolve faltering. It was a mistake, she said, her voice barely audible. I was confused. But I know what I want now, and it's not you. You're lying to yourself, Jackson replied, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to settle for him, Lila. Not when you could have everything with me. Before she could respond, Alex stepped out from behind the hedges, his face a mask of anger and pain. The sound of his footsteps startled them both, and they turned to face him, their expressions a mix of shock and guilt. Alex, Lila began, her voice trembling. I can explain. Explain what? Alex's voice was cold, razor sharp. That you've been sneaking around with my best friend? That you kissed him while we were planning our future together? Lila's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. Jackson stepped forward as if to defend her, but Alex held up a hand to stop him. Don't, Alex said, his voice low and dangerous. You don't get to say anything. The three of them stood there in tense silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Alex felt exposed, humiliated, as though every guest at the wedding could see the scene unfolding. He thought of the vows they had exchanged just hours earlier, the promises of fidelity and trust. How hollow they seemed now. I trusted you, Alex said finally, his voice breaking. He looked at Lila, his eyes searching hers for some semblance of the woman he thought he knew. I gave you everything. Lila reached out for him, but he stepped back, the hurt in his eyes making her falter. Jackson said nothing, his guilt evident in the way he avoided Alex's gaze. The sound of laughter and music from the reception drifted over the hedges, a cruel reminder of the celebration happening just feet away. Alex took a shaky breath, the enormity of the betrayal sinking in. He had never felt more humiliated, more betrayed, than he did in that moment. And as he turned and walked away, leaving them standing there, he wondered how he would ever face the guests, his family, his life, knowing what had just transpired. The reception had reached its peak. The orchestra played a lively tune, and the dance floor was alive with swirling couples, the clink of champagne glasses, and bursts of laughter. Alex moved mechanically through the throng of guests, smiling and nodding as congratulations poured in. His head, however, was a storm of emotions. Every glance at Lila felt like a fresh sting. Her radiant smile, her effortless grace as she floated from table to table, felt like a betrayal now, like a mask hiding the truth of what had happened at the gazebo. Alex tried to shake the image of Jackson's smug, pleading face and Lila's trembling denial, but it clung to him, poisoning every joyful moment. His hands trembled as he clutched a glass of champagne. He told himself to keep it together. This day wasn't just for him, it was for their families, their friends. But the gnawing question remained. Was the life he thought they were building together already a lie? Across the garden, Alex saw Lila talking to her parents, her laughter ringing out like a bell. He felt a pang of resentment. How could she laugh so easily, knowing what she'd done? He clenched his jaw and turned away, forcing himself to focus on the guests around him. Alex! One of his uncles called out, pulling him into a boisterous hug. What a day, huh? You're a lucky man. Lila's 1 in a million. Alex managed a tight smile, nodding along as his uncle continued to praise his new bride. Inside he felt hollow. The words no longer resonated the way they had that morning. Lila was beautiful, yes, but the image of her with Jackson was a dark stain on his memory, impossible to erase. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Alex noticed Lila slipping away again. His stomach twisted as he followed her movements, his gaze narrowing when she veered toward the same willow-shrouded gazebo where he had caught her and Jackson earlier. This time, she wasn't alone. Jackson trailed after her, his posture tense, his face set with determination. Alex hesitated. Part of him wanted to walk away, to pretend he hadn't seen them. He wanted to cling to the illusion of his wedding day, no matter how shattered it had already become. But the ache in his chest, The need to know the truth propelled him forward. Keeping his distance, Alex followed them, weaving through the shadows cast by the setting sun. Reaching the edge of the gazebo, Alex stopped short, hidden by the trailing branches of the willow tree. His heart pounded as he saw them standing close, their bodies angled toward each other. Their voices were low, urgent, but he couldn't make out the words. He strained to listen, his pulse thundering in his ears. Then it happened. Lila reached up and placed her hands on Jackson's chest. For a moment, Alex dared to hope she was pushing him away, setting firm boundaries as she'd claimed she would. But the hope shattered when she leaned in, her lips meeting Jackson's with a fervor that made Alex's stomach churn. It wasn't a brief, hesitant kiss. It was passionate, raw, as if the world around them didn't exist, as if they had forgotten that just beyond the hedges, 100 people were celebrating their union. Alex's breath caught, and for a moment, he couldn't move. He was frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend the sight before him. His wife, his bride of mere hours, was kissing another man. Not just any man, but Jackson, his closest friend. The betrayal was no longer whispered words or veiled glances. It was a stark, undeniable reality playing out in front of him. His paralysis gave way to a flood of emotions: fury, humiliation, heartbreak. His fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as he fought the urge to confront them. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to demand answers, to shout, to stop them. But the humiliation rooted him in place. This wasn't just a private betrayal, it was a spectacle. If he stormed in now, the illusion of the perfect day would crumble, and everyone would know. As if the kiss weren't damning enough, Lila's voice reached him, soft and breathless. "Jackson," she whispered, her hands still lingering on his chest, "we can't keep doing this. Someone will see." "Then let them," Jackson replied, his voice low but filled with intensity. "I don't care about any of this, about the wedding, the guests, Alex. It's you I care about." Lila pulled back slightly, her gaze flickering toward the garden. "I do care," she said, though her voice wavered. "This isn't fair to him. I made a promise." "You made a promise to yourself too," Jackson countered. "To be happy. To follow your heart. And I know I'm what you want." The words were like knives, each one driving deeper into Alex's chest. He wanted to yell, to demand they stop, but his voice wouldn't come. He felt like an intruder in his own life, watching it unravel from a distance. The humiliation of it all stung deeper than any anger. This was supposed to be their day, his and Lila's. Instead, it had become a farce, a cruel joke. Alex's vision blurred with unshed tears as he stumbled back from the gazebo. He needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating weight of what he'd just witnessed. He moved blindly through the garden, avoiding the paths filled with guests, slipping into a secluded corner where he could finally catch his breath. The laughter and music of the reception felt like a cruel mockery, a celebration of a union that already felt broken. Alex leaned against a tree, his chest heaving as he tried to process the betrayal. He thought of the vows they had exchanged, the promises of love and fidelity. Were they lies? Had Lila been thinking of Jackson even then? The humiliation was unbearable. He imagined the whispers that would follow if anyone found out. The sympathetic looks, the pitying smiles. He could already hear the murmurs, "Poor Alex. Married just hours ago, and she's already with someone else." The thought made him sick. As the minutes dragged on, Alex forced himself to think. He couldn't let this moment define him. But what could he do? Confront them? End the marriage before it had even begun? Or keep quiet, preserve the illusion for the sake of the guests, and deal with the fallout later? Each option felt like a fresh wound, a reminder of how deeply he had been betrayed. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Alex returned to the reception. The garden was bathed in the soft glow of string lights, the atmosphere warm and festive. No one seemed to notice his absence or the turmoil brewing beneath his composed exterior. He spotted Lila rejoining the crowd, her cheeks flushed, her smile radiant. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the kiss with Jackson were a distant memory. Alex's stomach twisted at the sight. He wondered how she could pretend so easily, how she could stand there and greet guests as if her betrayal weren't a dagger lodged in his back. But Alex said nothing. He plastered a smile on his face and returned to the throng of well-wishers, playing the role of the happy groom. Inside, however, he felt like a man watching his own life unravel, powerless to stop it. The humiliation of it all burned like a brand, and he knew this day, the day that was supposed to be the happiest of his life, would haunt him forever. Alex stood rooted to the spot, hidden behind the drooping branches of the willow tree. His mind reeled, struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Lila, his wife of only a few hours, was in Jackson's arms, her lips locked with his. The intensity of the kiss left no room for interpretation. It was filled with passion and longing, the kind that seemed to erase the world around them. The betrayal was so complete, so overwhelming, that Alex felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. For a moment, Alex couldn't move. His chest tightened as his breath came in shallow gasps, his fists clenched at his sides. His heart, which had been filled with love and anticipation just hours earlier, now felt shattered into pieces too small to put back together. The searing pain in his chest was joined by a rising tide of anger. Not just at Lila, but at Jackson, the man he had trusted implicitly, the man he had chosen as a groomsman on this most important day of his life. Alex fought the urge to storm into the gazebo, to rip them apart and demand answers. The thought of their startled faces, their pathetic excuses, almost pushed him over the edge. But he stopped himself. This wasn't the time or place. Guests were only a few yards away, laughing and toasting to the supposed love and commitment he and Lila had just pledged to each other. If he caused a scene, the humiliation would spread like wildfire through the crowd, and he would be at the center of it all. Instead, Alex stepped back, his movements careful and deliberate. The branches of the willow tree swayed gently, concealing him as he retreated toward the garden. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of what he had seen threatened to drag him down. The voices of the guests grew louder as he rejoined the party, their laughter and clinking glasses a cruel contrast to the turmoil inside him. His face burned with shame as he glanced around the crowd. Did anyone know? Had anyone seen? Every smile directed his way felt laced with pity, every congratulations sounded hollow. Alex felt like an actor in a tragic play, forced to perform for an audience oblivious to the disaster unfolding behind the scenes. He made his way to the bar, nodding stiffly at the bartender before ordering a whiskey. The burn of the alcohol steadied him, giving him something tangible to focus on amid the chaos in his mind. He sipped it slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd. Lila was back among the guests now, her cheeks flushed, her laughter light and untroubled. Jackson wasn't far behind, blending seamlessly into a group of mutual friends. The ease with which they both slipped back into the celebration was nauseating. Alex's grip tightened around his glass as he observed them. How long had this been going on? The thought churned in his mind, each possible answer more painful than the last. Had it started during their engagement? Before that? He thought of the moments they had all shared together, the jokes, the confidences, the plans. How much of it had been a lie? His thoughts shifted to Jackson. The man had been a part of Alex's life for years, someone he had trusted with his secrets, his worries. To think that Jackson had been betraying him all this time, right under his nose, made Alex's stomach turn. He replayed their recent conversations, searching for clues he might have missed. Had there been signs? Glances? Was it possible everyone else had noticed except him? The idea of being the last to know stung deeply. Alex's pride, his very sense of self, felt bruised. He had always thought of himself as someone who could read people, someone who understood the dynamics of those closest to him. But now, he felt like a fool, a man who had been played by the two people he had cared for most. The bartender refilled his glass without being asked, offering a sympathetic smile that made Alex's skin crawl. He downed the drink in one gulp, the burn doing little to dull the ache inside him. He couldn't stay here, surrounded by people who might see through his facade at any moment. But where could he go? This was his wedding reception. Disappearing would only raise questions, draw attention to himself in a way he desperately wanted to avoid. Alex forced himself to rejoin the party, plastering on a smile that felt like a mask. He moved from group to group, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, his mind racing all the while. Each time he saw Lila across the garden, his stomach twisted. Her carefree demeanor, the way she glowed under the lights, made him feel like a stranger in his own life. Was this the woman he had fallen in love with? The woman he had promised to spend the rest of his life with? At one point their eyes met. Lila's smile faltered for the briefest moment, and Alex felt a surge of anger. Did she feel guilty? Was she afraid he had seen? He wanted to confront her then and there, to wipe the smugness from her face. But the weight of the guest's expectations held him back. Instead, he nodded at her, his expression unreadable, and turned away. As the evening wore on, Alex found himself drawn to the edge of the garden, away from the revelry. He needed space to think, to plan his next move. Confronting Lila and Jackson in private was inevitable, but the timing had to be right. He didn't want to act out of pure emotion, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. The truth was, Alex had no idea what he would do. Divorce seemed like the obvious choice, but the thought of it filled him with dread. The scandal, the questions from family and friends, the public unraveling of their relationship, it was too much to consider. And what about his feelings for Lila? Despite everything, a part of him still loved her, still clung to the hope that there was some explanation, some way to salvage what they had. But then he thought of the kiss, the way she had clung to Jackson as though Alex didn't exist. That image was burned into his mind, a constant reminder of her betrayal. Could he ever forgive her? Could he ever trust her again? The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Alex from his thoughts. He turned to see Jackson walking toward him, his hands in his pockets, his expression carefully neutral. Alex's heart pounded as he braced himself for the confrontation. "Alex," Jackson began, his voice low. "I was hoping we could talk." Alex's jaw tightened. "Now's not the time, Jackson." Jackson hesitated, then nodded. "I understand. But when you're ready." "I said not now." Alex's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet. Jackson flinched, but said nothing more. He turned and walked away, leaving Alex alone once again. The night stretched on, each passing moment a test of Alex's resolve. The weight of the betrayal, the anger, and the humiliation threatened to crush him, but he held himself together, determined to make it through the evening. For now, he would play the role expected of him. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, and Alex knew it was only a matter of time before it broke. The evening sky was awash with the warm glow of string lights as the time for the final ceremony drew near, the exchanging of vows and the speeches. Guests, full from the dinner and drinks, gathered eagerly under the canopies set up at the center of the garden. The stage was beautifully adorned with cascading flowers and delicate candles, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. Lila stood beside Alex, her radiant smile directed at the crowd, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. To anyone else, she looked the picture of a glowing bride, utterly content in her new role as a wife. But Alex knew better. He had spent the hours since witnessing the kiss grappling with a maelstrom of emotions: pain, fury, humiliation. As he looked at her now, the betrayal boiled just beneath his carefully maintained surface. Jackson stood among the groomsmen, his expression unreadable, but Alex noticed the way he avoided making eye contact. It was a silent admission of guilt, a coward's way of trying to disappear into the background. The officiant began speaking, his voice rich and warm as he described the sanctity of marriage and the power of love. Alex barely heard him. His focus was on the moment to come, on the words he had rehearsed in his head over and over. He knew this was reckless, knew that this moment would change everything. But the anger inside him burned too brightly to be contained. If they thought they could make a fool of him, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The officiant turned to Alex, signaling that it was time for the vows. A ripple of excitement went through the crowd, and cameras lifted to capture the moment. Alex cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he held the microphone. He looked at Lila, her eyes soft and expectant, as though she had no inkling of the storm about to erupt. He smiled, an expression that felt foreign, false, but he held it long enough to lull everyone into a false sense of normalcy. Thank you all for being here today, Alex began, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. It means the world to Lila and me to have so many people we love in one place to celebrate what's supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. There was a murmur of approval from the crowd. Lila tilted her head slightly, her smile widening, though Alex caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. He pressed on, the words flowing more easily now, each one like a stone hurled at the facade they had built. Marriage is built on trust, on honesty, on mutual respect, Alex said, his voice growing firmer. It's about knowing that you can rely on your partner, that they will be faithful to you not just in action but in heart. Lila shifted beside him, her hands tightening around the bouquet. A nervous laugh escaped her lips, but Alex didn't acknowledge it. His gaze swept the crowd, his anger sharpening his focus. That's what I thought I had with Lila. He continued, his tone cutting. I thought I had found someone who valued those things as much as I did. Someone who would stand by me, who would honor the promises we made to each other. The crowd grew still, the festive air beginning to thin. Whispers rippled through the rows of guests, people glancing at one another in confusion. Alex saw Jackson stiffen in the corner of his vision, his face paling as he realized where this was heading. But today, Alex said, his voice now cold as steel, I learned the truth. I learned that my trust, my love, was misplaced. Alex, Lila began, stepping forward, her voice shaky with panic. Don't. Alex's voice cut through her protest like a whip, silencing her. He turned to face her fully now, his mask of composure slipping to reveal the raw hurt and fury beneath. Don't you dare try to interrupt me. Not after what you've done. Lila's face drained of color, her composure faltering as the whispers in the crowd grew louder. Alex turned back to the guests, gesturing toward Jackson, who was now visibly sweating, his gaze darting toward the nearest exit. You see, Alex said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, while all of you were here celebrating what you thought was a day of love and commitment, Lila and Jackson were busy sneaking off together. Sharing a kiss that I'm sure they hoped no one would see. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Lila's mother clutched her chest, her face a mask of shock. Jackson's wife, seated near the front, stared at him with wide eyes, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth. The once celebratory atmosphere was now thick with tension, every pair of eyes darting between Alex, Lila, and Jackson. That's right, Alex continued, his voice rising. My wife, my bride, decided that on our wedding day, it was perfectly acceptable to betray me with my best friend. Lila reached for his arm, her voice breaking as she whispered, Please, Alex, stop this. Let's talk about this privately. Privately? Alex barked, yanking his arm away. Why should this stay private when you didn't care about privacy before? Why should I spare your humiliation when you had no problem humiliating me? Jackson finally stepped forward, his voice trembling as he stammered, Alex, it's not what you think. Don't you dare try to spin this, Jackson, Alex snarled, pointing a finger at him. You were supposed to be my friend, my brother. And this is how you repay me? By sneaking behind my back with my wife? The tension in the air was unbearable now. Some guests tried to avert their eyes, embarrassed to witness such an intimate betrayal laid bare. Others leaned forward, unable to look away, their expressions a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. I trusted both of you, Alex said, his voice breaking. And you didn't just betray me, you mocked everything this day was supposed to stand for. You turned it into a joke, and I'm the punchline. Lila's tears flowed freely now, streaking her carefully applied makeup. She tried to speak, to offer some excuse, but the words wouldn't come. Jackson looked as though he wanted to disappear, his face flushed with shame. Alex took a deep breath, steadying himself. You think I'm going to forgive this? That I'm going to sweep it under the rug and pretend everything's fine? I deserve better than this. Better than both of you. He turned to the crowd, his voice firm and resolute. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry this day turned out like this, but at least now you know the truth. With that, Alex dropped the microphone, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing through the stunned silence. He walked off the stage, leaving Lila sobbing and Jackson frozen in place. The guests erupted into a cacophony of murmurs and exclamations, the scandal unraveling before their eyes. Alex didn't look back. The weight of his decision was heavy, but so was the clarity that came with it. He had exposed their betrayal for all to see, and though the pain still burned fiercely, he knew he had reclaimed his dignity.